Thanks, I really appreciate that. Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. I know you had a long, eventful night at sea last night on the Adichie. Well done. I thank you, French, for that very kind introduction. When people hear it, you know, Supreme Allied Commander, 4-star Admiral, etc., they generally have two reactions. One is, boy, I thought you'd be taller than you appear to be. And the other one is they say, well, you know, Stavridis, if you're really that cool, why were you not a naval aviator? You know, like Goose and Maverick and Top Gun? Because I was not. I was a ship driver. I drove destroyers, just like French Caldwell drove submarines. Let's face it, the glamorous part of the Navy are those carriers and those fighters. And I wanted to be a fighter pilot desperately. But I had a very traumatic experience as a young boy that made aviation difficult for me. So I'm going to take just 30 minutes and we're going to look at global security because it impacts what you do in your world. And we're going to look at 21st century security, obviously. But before we go to the 21st century, I want to take you back to the 20th century. Let's go back 100 years ago. The world is in the middle of World War I. This photograph taken in 1914. It's at the French Military Academy, like West Point here in the United States. This place is called Saint-Cyr. And this is the graduating class of 1914. Look at those faces. They're fired up. They're ready to go. They head into battle in 1914. By 1918, everybody in this photograph is dead. This is the First World War. 20 million die in Europe. It's an epic failure of global security. And you have to ask yourself, why did so many people die, not only in the First World War, 20 million, but the Second World War as well? This is the Battle of Stalingrad, where in a period of 6 months, 2 million casualties in this battle between Germany and Russia. This is the iconic moment when the Russians seized the city of Stalingrad. That's the Russian flag. So as a security professional, I ask myself, why did we fail so badly in the 20th century? We tried again and again to create security like this by building walls. Maginot Line, Schlieffen Plan, Iron Curtain, Bamboo Curtain, most iconically the Berlin Wall. Security failed us in the 20th century, and it's because our opponents have figured out how to get around walls. Now this occurred to me the most vividly on this terrible day, on 9/11. You're in Washington, D.C. today. On 9/11, that little red circle was my office. So I watched the airplane hit the Pentagon, literally. I was a newly selected 1-star admiral, very proud of that first star. And as I stumbled out, having luckily survived because the plane broke left at the last minute, what occurred to me was the irony of this moment. Here I was, protected by every wall you can imagine. I'm in the concrete walls of the Pentagon. I'm surrounded by the strongest military on earth in the capital of the richest country on the planet. Was I safe? No. Our opponents have learned to get around walls. And so today we face things like the Islamic State. This is Modiq Satiq. He's a member of the Islamic State. He became famous 18 months ago within the Islamic State. He became famous by dragging his mother out of the post office in Raqqa, Syria, and executing her publicly in the town square. That's the kind of violent extremism that emanates from the radicalized portions of the Islamic world. But of course, it's not just Islam. Let's come a little closer to home. This is a peaceful European country, Norway. This is Oslo, several summers ago. This handsome young man, upper right, his name is Anders Breivik. He blows up the government house, like blowing up the old executive office building here in Washington. He kills 7, but far worse, he then takes high-powered weapons, goes to a small island off the coast of Oslo, and kills execution-style 70 young people between the ages of 18 and 24 at what we would think of in the United States as boy state or girl state. He was caught. You see him upper left, apologizing in court. He's apologizing, his words, to the forces of right-wing nationalism in Europe for not having killed more people on that day. Violent extremism, political violent extremism. And here in the United States, racial extremism. Bottom right, Dylan Roof executes a group of worshipers at one of the most iconic African-American churches in our nation, in Charleston, South Carolina. Upper right, State Senator Pinckney was killed. So this kind of violent extremism in the world that we traditionally think of it somehow, in the Middle East, Afghanistan, it manifests in Europe, in politics, and here in our own country, racially. So of all those groups, the one I worry about the most at the moment is this, the Islamic State, because they are experts at branding and marketing. Look at that black flag. Think about it as a trademark. 3 years ago, nobody in this room could have identified that flag. Today, it is the most downloaded image on the World Wide Web. Also, they are experts, upper right, at making money. They sell human beings. They traffic in drugs. They use cyber criminal activity. They smuggle hydrocarbons. They're a money-making machine. And even though we are closing in on them in Raqqa, their capital, and in Mosul, in Iraq, even so, they continue to make enough money to finance global attacks. Now think about these slides as I walk through them quickly. This is 18 months ago. In 18 months, the Islamic State has blown up a Russian commercial aircraft full of innocent tourists flying from Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. They launched attacks in Paris that seem like a distant memory now. 150 dead. They blow up a marketplace in Lebanon. 100 dead. United States, San Bernardino, California, 8 dead. Pulse nightclub, the largest mass shooting in U.S. history, 55 dead. Repeated attacks in Istanbul and other parts of Turkey. Britain has now gone through 3 significant attacks. The first, again, feels like a distant memory. It was 6 weeks ago. Sweden, truck attack. Egypt, Coptic church, 80 dead. More recently, the concert, Ariana Grande in Manchester, Afghanistan, in case you missed this one, 88 dead last week. Most recently, the London Bridge attack that continues to drive the news cycle. And have you checked the news today? An attack in Tehran. Think about that in 18 months. That's a global organization. And most worryingly, they have a plan. Now look at Spain. I don't think Spain is going to be called Andalus anytime soon. But when an organization is that creative, is a master at branding, marketing, recruiting, proselytizing, has global sweep in their activities, raises money like we've never seen a terrorist organization to do, and has a plan, we ought to be very worried. So as I look at 21st century security, I worry about this organization. I also worry about some nations. I worry about Iran that continues to pursue not nuclear weapons. I think we have a deal that will cap that for a decade. That's good. But Iran continues to try and gain intercontinental ballistic missile technology. The Iran deal, I think, will hold off, but we ought to remember this is how Iran sees itself. They are descendants of the Persian Empire. These are the battle flags of the ancient Persians, upper left. One from 2,500 years ago, one from 1,000 years ago. Today's Iran, 3 flags across the top. You see the map there? That was the Persian Empire at its greatest extent, and we see Iran continue to push those boundaries today. So I worry about Iran. And in particular, I worry about Iranian influence in an area of the world where we have strong allies, like the Saudis, like the Israelis. So Iran is part of our set of concerns. But Iran is not the most dangerous country in the world. The most dangerous country in the world is North Korea. Why? Because leadership matters, and the leader of North Korea is very well named. His name is Kim Jong-un. And he is unpredictable, unstable, untested. He's got a really bad haircut. He's also morbidly obese, addicted to opioids. And here's the punchline. He already has nuclear weapons. He's got at least 15, and he's increasingly capable of miniaturizing, hardening, and delivering them at distance. You need to think of it as kind of 2 streams. One is nuclear weapons, the other is ballistic missiles. It's like in Ghostbusters. You don't want those streams to cross in terms of distance to the United States, and they will cross in the next 18 to 24 months. So alongside Iran, we had to worry quite a bit about North Korea. We should worry about Syria for a variety of reasons. This is Assad, the dictator. He's a war criminal. There are 500,000 dead in this conflict, 14 million pushed across borders and displaced, all of which leads to great power competition in the Eastern Mediterranean. That's the flag of Russia next to the United States. And what does it all lead to? This. Refugees, waves of them. Millions have gone to Europe, destabilizing the politics there. Many more millions are stopped in refugee camps around the borders of Syria. All of that makes Syria part of our watch list of concern. What else? We had to worry a bit about this place, which you haven't thought of in a while, I would guess. This is Ukraine. You'll recall Russia invaded it. They annexed part of it called Crimea. So I can show you a map. Looks pretty benign, right? Here's what Ukraine actually looks like. It's a war. 15,000 people have been killed in this war in the last 2 years. And our problem here in the United States, and thinking about Ukraine, is we keep looking at this map, looking for the strategic terrain, but it's not on that map. The strategic terrain is right there. It's Vladimir Putin, who is pushing always on the borders around Russia. So Russia ought to concern us alongside the other nations that I've mentioned. It's not always nations that we ought to worry about. It is also things like this. What crop is this? Anybody know? Very good. Poppies, which are turned into heroin, which is part of the opioid epidemic here in the United States. And of course, it's not just heroin. It's also cocaine. And let me just kind of park the moral issue of should people use heroin or cocaine. I look at that as A, a personal choice, and B, a medical challenge. What I worry about is the money, the profit that comes out of this, which destabilizes fragile democracies, contributes greatly to corruption. And I'll give you an example. This is actually a very hopeful photograph. This is a cocaine bust at sea in the Gulf of Mexico. And therefore, it's a good picture. This is a high-tech U.S. Navy vessel capturing a drug runner. The bad news is that the high-tech U.S. Navy vessel in this photograph is the one on top. The one on the bottom that looks like Batman's submarine, that was built in Colombia by the drug cartels. When we caught this thing, and truth in advertising, there's a Navy destroyer just outside the picture. When we caught this thing, it had 10 tons of cocaine in it. 10 tons of cocaine. Street value, $150 million. Cost the cartel $2 million to build this thing, $2 million for the coke, $1 million in bribes, carrying cost. That's $5 million in, $150 million out. That's margin. If you went to business school, that's EBITDA. We had to worry about the way that can undermine democracies. Asia's bubbling. I don't see a war with China. These are Chinese ballistic missile submarines. I think we can find our way to a cooperative relationship with China. But we need to be mindful of the challenges in the South China Sea strategically. We should also remember not all of our problems are man-made. This is Ebola at the top and Zika at the bottom. Upper right is patient 0. He died in a hospital in Dallas here in the United States. We dodged a bullet with Ebola. 100 years ago, 1918, Spanish influenza, Spanish flu, a pandemic infects 40% of the world's population with a mortality rate of 20%. A pandemic is coming. Now, we are much better at containing it and dealing with it. We have better tools in every dimension, but we ought to be mindful of this as part of our security challenges. And we ought to recognize environmental challenges as well. The ice in the Arctic Ocean is melting. We can have a debate, I guess, about global warming. Personally, I think it's settled science, but I'll tell you as a mariner, the ice is melting. It will open shipping routes. It will open hydrocarbons. It will create extreme tension in the high north. So on our list of challenges, you have to add that as well. So as I wrap up this tale of woe this morning, I'm now going to answer the question I got most frequently when I was the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO for 4 years. People would say, well, Admiral, what keeps you awake at night? Is it Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, piracy? I worried about all those things, but we had the tools to deal with it. The thing I worried about the most is right here. It's cybersecurity. Those are the flags of Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Georgia, a small republic in the Caucasus. What they have in common is that all of them have been attacked since 2008 by Russia. And are we vulnerable here? You bet we are. The electric grid is our highest vulnerability. We're vulnerable in all sectors, including the ones in which you work the most, and financial. But it's the grid we ought to worry about. This is a terrific book, by the way, on the grid. And sometimes people say to me, well, how concerned should we be about, the grid? And I'll say, well, think of it this way. I'll tell you a tale of two scientists. If we asked Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone, to come back, and we said to Alexander Graham Bell, this is a telephone, has no wires, it can talk point to point anywhere in the world, it can access all the world's knowledge, you can listen to any symphony ever recorded, you can watch any movie ever made, you can take photographs with it. He would look at it, Bell would look at it like a pig looking at a wristwatch. It would make no sense. But if we brought back Thomas Alva Edison, who harnessed electricity, he built the first grid on a city block in New York City. If we brought Thomas Alva Edison back and showed him the grid, he would roll up his sleeves and say, you bet, I can help you with that. The point is, we have invested enormously, I don't need to tell this group, in information technology, but we have not invested in the grid and protecting it. So we ought to worry about that. We ought to worry about the way small nations like North Korea can attack big nations. This movie comes out. This is a terrible movie, by the way. This movie comes out, and it is a movie that makes a mockery of Kim Jong-un. the leader of North Korea. He unleashes his cyber dogs and they attack Sony Pictures, American corporation. They do tens of millions of dollars worth of damage. So it's not just big nations like Russia attacking small nations. It's not just Russia and the United States. It's small nations using cyber to equalize and attack us. There's also huge, again, I don't need to tell this group, cyber criminal activity, which comes from China, Nigeria, Brazil, Ukraine, Russia, Vietnam, and of course right here in the United States. That cyber criminal activity is going up like a rocket. You'll recall 3 years ago, about 60 million accounts hacked between Home Depot and Target. About a year and a half ago, JP Morgan Chase, 87 million accounts. A couple of months ago, Yahoo, 500 million accounts. Now my first reaction was, really? Yahoo has 500 million accounts? But look at the trajectory of those numbers. Biggest bank robbery in American history? Was it Al Capone, Jesse James? Nope. It was the Federal Reserve Bank of New York with money coming from Bangladesh, Bank of Bangladesh, upper right, going to small accounts in the Philippines, almost $100 million. And most recently, a couple of weeks ago, WannaCry. This is a global pandemic in the cyber world. Hundreds of thousands of computers affected in 160 different countries. And lastly on cyber, I'll just say it's personal. Cyber is personal. Who is this? Jennifer Lawrence, beautiful young Academy Award-winning actress. Several years ago, she takes some, shall we say, intimate photographs of herself, intended for her significant other, 2 consenting adults, no big deal. Unfortunately, she posts those in an account in the cloud, which is hacked and widely distributed. That's a crime. The perpetrator was caught. I put it here to remind us that only cyber goes from the highest levels of our national concerns through our finances, through our grid, to the most personal details of our lives. That's why we ought to worry about cyber. All of this has a context. Brexit, centrifugal forces pulling apart our closest allies in Europe. What's our problem here? Gridlock. Our political parties can't work together. Our branches of government cannot work together. We have work to do here as well. And all of it leads to this, a sense that the world's too hard, it's too complicated. Can't we just build some walls? Won't work. So right about now, you ought to be saying, okay, Admiral, I'm worried. You know, it's a dangerous world. So what do you think? What should we do about it? What are the opportunities to create security? Well, the top of my list may surprise you. Now you think I'm going to hit this clicker and the next thing is going to be an aircraft carrier coming right at you. No. The number one thing we can do to create security is listen better. Listen better. This, by the way, is not Photoshop. This gentleman is listening for incoming aircraft in the 1930s. I put it here as metaphor. We need to do a vastly better job understanding our allies, our opponents, and finding ways to do what you're doing right here, to unplug and build intellectual capital. This is the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, where we send our young men and women to take a break, a week, a month, a semester, to study and learn and build intellectual capital. We need to read more, all of us, but especially our leaders. And it's not just nonfiction. We should be reading more novels that tell us about other cultures. If you want to really understand what's going on in North Korea, check out The Orphan Master's Son. It is a novel, but meticulously researched. It won the National Book Award a year ago. Want to understand Mexico and the border? Read the novel, The Cartel by Don Winslow. Want to understand Vladimir Putin, top center? Palace of Treason by Matthews. Find time to read a little fiction, and our leaders should be doing the same. Our nation remains an opportunity in the world. We have political capital, upper left. Our economy has flaws and challenges, but it's a good hand of cards. We have a professional, non-political military. We have a young population, bottom left. Here's a news flash. Immigration helps us. And in the center is a fracking tower. We are on the path with renewables, natural gas, fracking. We have to do it right environmentally. With all of that, we could be energy independent in the next decade. So the United States is an opportunity. The question is, who are our partners? NATO. NATO matters. 28 nations, 52% of the world's GDP. We will never have a richer pool of partners. We'll do more coalitions. We don't have to do this by ourselves. These are the nations who are together with us against the Islamic State. And I would argue in this century, our best potential ally is India. Fellow democracy, young nation, a country on the move, plenty of challenges. But it is a nation which will surpass China in population in several years, and the upside is extraordinary for a U.S.-Indian relationship. Do we still need a conventional military? There's your aircraft carrier. Yes, we need that capability. But we'll do more of this. This is another terrible movie, but it is a story about cyber and cyber conflict. Your military will be very involved in that world. We'll be doing a lot of this, unmanned, but the base of it all will be young men and women like this. This is Michael Murphy. He was the subject of a very good movie called Lone Survivor. Some of you may have seen it. This is the real Michael Murphy. He died in Afghanistan, 2008, where he received the Medal of Honor. All this high tech matters to defend us, and all those platforms matter. But at the end of the day, it's about young men and women who will go and stand for us. Let me introduce you to another one, by the way. This is Alex Adichie. Alex graduated from West Point about a year ago. He's a young second lieutenant in the Army, very proud. That photograph of him at his graduation went viral because he was crying. French and I are both graduates of Annapolis. On graduation day, everyone's smiling and laughing and throwing their hats in the air. Alex Adichie was crying. Reporter asked him, "Why were you crying on your graduation day?" He said, "Because when I came here in 2008 as a refugee from Haiti in a boat, I never could have imagined that I would stand on the plane at West Point and graduate." And by the way, you see all those stripes on his sleeve? He was a cadet commander at West Point, and you see the star on his collar? That's the superintendent's list for the very, very best. He graduated top of his class, majored in physics. Immigration helps us. Your military will do things like this: soft power, hospital ships, literacy training in Afghanistan. We need to be better at this. Strategic communications. This is the world according to Facebook. The brighter the white, the higher the concentration of Facebook users. And we still need this, personal contact. This is me 4 years ago when I was Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. I'm meeting with my counterpart from Russia, General Makarov, Supreme Commander of the Russian Armed Forces. I like General Makarov a lot, mostly because he's a man of normal height. Secretary Gates called me after this meeting and said, "Stavridis, how did the meeting go with General Makarov?" I said, "Well, pretty good. You know, we saw everything eye to eye." So last couple of slides, and then we'll open it up and have a conversation. I've talked a lot today about what might be called soft power, right? So reading, building intellectual capital, listening better, hospital ships, literacy training. I believe in soft power, but I would not want you to leave here today with the slightest shred of doubt about this, about the need for hard power and our ability to deliver it. This is a Tomahawk missile. It's so accurate we can fly it 1,500 miles and decide to fly it through that door or that door. We're very good at this. We can launch missiles with extreme lethality and precision. We need to be better at launching ideas. And military operations, creating security, is not an on and off switch. Your choices are not hard power or soft power. You have to have a rheostat to drive it in. If you do that, it becomes like Wikipedia. No one of us, no one person, no one nation, no one alliance is as smart as all of us thinking and working together. If we take that kind of approach and seek to build that global network, we have our best opportunity to create security in the 21st century. Thank you very much. Thank you. Cheers. Okay. Thank you.
So, Jim, besides getting me scared to death, you know, I had I wrote down a few questions, and I changed them all as you talked. But I looked at the, you know, the maps of the world that you had up there, and you know the arc of crisis.
Yeah.
In a way, does not seem to have changed a whole lot since the 1990s, right? The whole you know, area geopolitically, other than there appear to be new players who are harder to contain.
Yes.
And so, but I also, one of the things that I noticed was, you know, if I were sitting in Moscow, I might even be more concerned about that arc than I would if I were sitting in Washington.
Sure.
And yet we seem to have more tension with Moscow than ever these
Indeed.
days. Is that a distraction, or where do we put our political capital towards working with Moscow or trying to contain you know, all these different conflicts?
I want to first just make the big geopolitical point, French, which is that arc of crisis which you described, which kind of runs through the Middle East into the Eastern Mediterranean, perhaps west to Afghanistan. It continues to pull us in. But I would argue that what has changed is actually the rise of China and the impact of what's happening in the South China Sea. So Moscow doesn't have the throw weight to be a global actor, but they will continue to provide difficulty and challenge for us in that arc of crisis. So to your question, with Russia, we should confront them where we must. So that's Syria, cyber criminal activity, Ukraine, but we ought to seek to cooperate where we can with Russia, because we don't want to stumble back into a full-blown Cold War. We're close to doing that. So where can we cooperate? Counterterrorism, counter-piracy, counter-narcotics, perhaps in the Arctic, perhaps in missile defense, perhaps in arms control. So confront where we must, cooperate wherever we can, recognize that over time, the shift will be to the Pacific, away from that arc of crisis.
That's an interesting perspective, and certainly as we become less dependent on, you know, when Europe becomes less dependent on hydrocarbons,
exactly,
we'll be able to help shift that. But then the other thing that occurred to me when I looked at that, you know, at your charts there, was that, you know, when our audience typically looks at a map of the world, they're looking at supply chains. and they're looking at capital flows, and they're looking at labor sources and knowledge sources in markets, right? And it seems to be a totally different point of view than maybe what military planners look at. Is there a need to bring those together?
I think that they are coming together. And back to India, for example. If you look at the geopolitics of the 21st century, if you're a historian writing about the 21st century in 500 years, it's not going to be about the rise of China. It's going to be about the rise of India because of demographics, which are going to drive that. So here is an area where an enormous potential market is opening, and geopolitically, what you want to have is a confluence between, in this case, the United States, our European Union partners, and India, democracies. So here you see this merge, I think. The really interesting question is China, which is missing one thing. Its biggest challenge is that it is not a democracy. And at the end of the day, democracy is like a safety valve. When you become dissatisfied with your government, bang, the safety valve opens, you reshuffle the deck, you can move on. This, of course, is the nature of the last election in the United States. China doesn't have that safety valve. So as demographics put more pressure into that Chinese vessel, and they can't continue to grow at 8 to 10%, no safety valve. That, to me, is another reason China is more handicapped than India going forward in this century.
You know, talking about elections, the last election in France saw the Republicans and the socialists, who have been pretty stable for decades.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And they both lost, and a new political party was created on the fly.
Yep.
You know, is that something that maybe we should be expecting to see more of, where political parties are just custom made as we need them, as we move along? You know, does that change? Is that what happened here? Maybe?
Not quite, but I think you're on the right track. And, we tend to think here in the United States that if we opened up the U.S. Constitution, written in the 1780s, that somewhere in the Constitution it would say, and there'll be a Republican Party and a Democratic Party. As most folks know, we've had Federalists, we've had Whigs, we've had Nationalists, we had the Progressive Party, more popularly known as the Bull Moose Party, 100 years ago. That was a political force that emerged. So I think the United States is prime for another political party. Also because our politics are polarizing. All polls show that there's a middle tranche of Americans who identify neither with hard right nor hard left. I think there's very fertile ground in there. That's essentially what happened in France. Somewhat more complicated story, but I think there's real potential for that over the next decade or so.
So political uncertainty, though, seems to be a new norm as well, right?
Indeed.
All around the world. We've seen it, populism. You mentioned India. Modi was essentially a populist president.
Entirely.
Brazil's government has been overthrown by populism. They seem to not quite know where they're going there. We have a populist president here. Populism essentially overthrew the government in the UK in a way. So is this something that's you're a great historian, by the way. So is this something that we should be putting into our business calculations, or is this something that we can look at as sort of a temporary transition?
Not a temporary transition. What we need to remember about populism is that it's democracy on steroids. When Alexis de Tocqueville came to the United States in 1840 to examine this relatively new phenomena of democracy, he wrote a book called On Democracy. And it's a largely laudatory book, French, but the bottom line is that he concludes with is that the tragedy of democracy is that in the end you elect the government you deserve. His point was that we need to own this process more than we do. And so populism is a reflection of that, of the owners of this corporation called the United States or France or Italy. We're about to have a big, interesting election in Italy. We need to own it more. Populism can be a force for good. I would argue Macron's election is an example of that. It reinforces values. It re-strengthens the European Union. It creates a sense of movement in France. So there are good populist movements, and there are populist movements that may take nations in less good directions. I'd point to one there would be the Philippines, which elects a leader like Duterte, who is foul-mouthed, breaking ties everywhere, highly difficult to work with at an international level, and has, above all, has created a campaign of extrajudicial killings, supposedly in the name of cleaning up the country from drugs. That's an example, in my view, of populism which has gone in the wrong direction. In France, I think you see populism going in the right direction. We'll see both. The reason it's happening is because of the internet, of the ability for people to see this transparently and with real acceleration.
I think you're definitely onto something there. And de Tocqueville also criticized kind of the American political elites for not listening.
Correct.
He said that the political elites in Europe at the time, who were monarchies, essentially listened.
Exactly.
More.
And of course, that's the lesson of the last election here in the United States, is not listening.
Right. So I'd like to open this up. We have several minutes here for questions from our attendees. Right
Here comes the microphone, sir.
Yes, sir. Can you make a comment that after World War II, the United States had a Marshall Plan?
Yeah.
And did good things to rebuild our adversaries in Germany and Japan. Would those ideas be relevant in today's world of conflict based on religion and power struggles all over?
Absolutely. And let me contrast it, as I think most folks will recall from high school history, tale of two wars as they end. World War I, the United States rejects the League of Nations, retreats back home, goes into isolationism, creates tariff barriers called the Hawley-Smoot tariffs. How'd that all turn out? We cracked the global economy. It creates the rise of fascism. We're dragged back into a war vastly worse. Proving that nations can learn something. At the end of the Second World War, what do? The gentleman's point, the Marshall Plan, which, by the way, was in today's dollars even a trivial amount of money. In today's dollars, the Marshall Plan was $150 billion. That is nothing. But it hit real human capital in Europe, and it hit a population that desperately wanted another chance. So the question for us today is, can we use an approach like that? And I would say yes, and I'll give you two examples of where we've done it very successfully. One is the Balkans. Think back kind of 20 years ago. The Balkans are on fire. A place called Srebrenica, 8,000 men and boys executed over the course of a few days. It's a war between Christians, Muslims, and Orthodox Christians, Roman Catholics. So we saw hundreds of thousands dead, millions pushed across borders in the Balkans 20 years ago. What do? Marshall Plan, effectively. Europeans stepped in, they rebuilt structures, they brought them into place. Today, all of those nations are members of NATO, just about. They're members of the European Union. So we can do it, even in a very turbulent setting like that. I'll give you another example from our own hemisphere. It's the nation of Colombia, which has gone through a 60-year insurgency, looks a lot like Syria, and yet using what's called Plan Colombia, financed by the United States, trivial amount of money, we have helped the Colombians rebuild their country and move it forward. Now, are there still challenges in the Balkans and Colombia? Absolutely. But the long game in the Middle East is going to be a restructuring, a rebuilding, financed, I believe, over time by the Sunni Arab states. That's why our relationships there, although frustrating, matter deeply. So yes, you're on the right point. There are examples in recent history, and a Marshall Plan-like idea makes a lot of sense.
Okay, I would like to know the plan, what you think the sub-Saharan African is going to contribute to the world, as you've mentioned. You mentioned Nigeria, which is my country, though on the negative side. But again, everybody, we have our phases as we move on in life. So what do you think Africans will contribute in the nearest future? Because China seems to be having much foothold in Africa.
Indeed.
So if you are looking at India and China is looking at Africa, what do you think?
I think that, let me give you a couple facts. Africa is the largest continent population-wise in terms of its acceleration. There will be, Africa as a continent will overtake both China and India in the next 20 years. The problem for Africa, as you know quite well, is disputes within those countries. In your own beautiful country, we can look back to the Biafran Wars. We see the ongoing problems with Boko Haram today. We see the Christian-Muslim split. So these kind of challenges are part of the fabric of Africa. But I'll give you a very positive statistic. 8 out of the 12 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. The human capital in Africa is on the move. The AIDS issue is not quite under control, but being moved aside due to new medical technologies. I think there's enormous upside in Africa. China is very aware of this, will continue to work there. The United States needs to be engaged in that region as well. And so why India is an easier proposition is because although it has a great deal of disparate elements within it, including a Muslim-Hindi split, that's worrisome, it's still a unitary actor. For Africa, there has to be more crafted solutions for South Africa, for Nigeria, for Liberia, for Uganda, for Kenya. Each of these countries are distinct, have different languages in many cases, have different tribal structures. So it's a more complex problem, but the upside, as you correctly point out, and as I hope I reinforce, is quite high.
African Union troops have also been extraordinarily good allies in Somalia.
Correct.
And other places
In East Africa, we see African Union troops, including Nigerians, who have been very, very effective against a terrorist group called Al-Shabaab.
So we've got just time for 1 or 2 more questions. Sonal?
Hello. Yeah. Great. So thank you so much. Very, very intriguing conversation here. So my question is around information, and in this information age, there's a lot of information, a lot of news and information that is coming in that may or may not be accurate or contradictory, right? From different sources, whether they be the government or news, media, or just people's thoughts, right? So what is your advice to us, both from a corporate perspective, what can we do, with our companies, is a lot of us are in the technology space or creating some of that social media platforms.
Yeah.
And what can we do as citizens in order to have a good filter on that information?
Yeah, this is a terrific question. And just to rip something from today's headlines, part of the reason there's been this huge blow up in the Persian Gulf over the last couple of days between Qatar, very important U.S. ally on one side, and Saudi Arabia, the UAE, very important U.S. allies on the other side, they've broken diplomatic relations. the Saudis are about to cut off food going into Qatar. What caused that? A lot of underlying tension, but the spark was fake news, appears to have been planted by Russia, about a fake speech that the Emir of Qatar supposedly gave, in which he praised Israel and praised Iran. He never gave that speech, but the media ran with it. It got woven into the fabric of Saudi and UAE view, and it created a catalyst to actually break relations between two strong sets of US allies. So those kind of incidents are happening again and again and again, both in our domestic politics and in the international sphere. So what should we do? First, we should learn what sites are reliable. And that is a knowable set of facts. And here we have to put faith, in my view, in our media. Now, not all media, but when you see something that has Wall Street Journal on it, or NBC News, or CNN, or Fox, these are political actors that are spread across, but these are responsible journalistic outlets, and they're matched in other nations. And so knowing where the responsible parts of the media are is point one. Point two is being judicious in what you get off the internet. And this is something that in your corporate space you can be talking to your employees about. Enormous damage is done by people simply forwarding garbage from ridiculous sites. I saw one the other day that said, and it was flying all around the internet, you have to be extremely careful about everything you read on the internet. It was a quote from Abraham Lincoln. So there is a self-educating, let's use our common sense here piece of this. And then thirdly, we ought to be ensuring that in our schools, that our children are understanding these dangers. And even at the graduate level, I'm currently the dean of a graduate school with 28-year-old men and women, extremely mature people from all around the world. And we spend a fair amount of time talking about how to cut through the chaff. And I'll give you a fourth point, and it's simply what I've talked about here today is knowing history and knowing real facts about what's happened in the world helps you identify stories and internet nonsense, because you know that the Emir of Qatar would never give a speech praising the Israelis. You would know that if you knew anything about history. So your own self-knowledge and resources really matter as well. I could go on, but I'll stop there with those four.
Well, Jim, thank you very much. Really
My pleasure.
appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure. Thank you all.